Hello and welcome to this session of the Productivity Insights Network. As in a sense, this is the last of a series. You are already familiar with the content or much of the content of the book, the edited volume that the network has come up with that has to do with the COVID-19 pandemic, and looking forward and sort of trying to sort of both understand from our past experiences, but then sort of looking forward to try to figure out the what we can do in terms of policies in trying to enhance the productivity of this country, which has been a challenge for quite a while now. Just to sort of get the background of what COVID has done to us, as we are all familiar with, but just so that, to provide a little bit of a context. One of the things that has obviously happened is that we are now, we were faced certainly a year ago with one can sort of describe as Knightian uncertainty. So we had very little idea about how things are going to progress over the course of the next 10 months, 12 months, 1 year. In fact, we didn't even know that we would have a vaccine at this stage, and that that there might be a closure to this at some point in the foreseeable future. Now, when faced with Knightian uncertainty, I mean, the economic theory tells us that all economic agents and companies included, their management and so on, the best response is obviously to just wait and watch and see how things pan out. But then the question is that once something like the COVID-19 pandemic happens, it also brings about structural change to the way we do things and the way that the economy functions. And this leads to the next set of questions, that some of the things that gave firms competitive advantage, let's say before the pandemic, may not sort of give them that advantage after the pandemic. So there is the issue of how do you sort of recalibrate the resources that you have within your companies in order to deal with the challenges of the future? How do you remain competitive in the future? How do you enhance your productivity in the future, right? And this is not just a matter of reorienting your current resources. It may require investment in new resources to complement the ones that you already have. And this is not something that is going to happen only because of the COVID pandemic. We sort of know that similar things happened after the 2008 financial crisis, but to a much lesser extent. And this is possibly going to get accelerated as we go forward. So, if we can move forward now to the slide that we are going to have, but before that, let me briefly introduce the speakers for today. We have Professor Gary Dimsky with us. He's a professor of applied economics at the Leeds University Business School at the University of Leeds. We have Dr. Hannah Szymborska, which is senior lecturer in economics at Birmingham City Business School at Birmingham City University. We have with us also Dr. Ekehard Ernst, who is the Chief of Macroeconomic Policies and Jobs Unit at the ILO, the International Labour Organization. And we have Professor Don Weber, who is the Professor of Managerial Economics at the Sheffield University Management School, a colleague of mine, and that's obviously at the University of Sheffield. Right. So we have the panelists, all the panelists on the screen now, I suppose. I hope you can see them as well. So moving forward to the next slide. Just to give a brief background of the Productivity Insights Network. It was set up and established in January 2018 and is funded by the ESRC, as you can see. And it's very, very multidisciplinary. There are many different people from a number of universities and from very different disciplinary backgrounds who try to explore and understand what are the things that hold back productivity growth in the UK, and how therefore to come up with potential policy solutions to that problem, right? Moving forward, next slide, please. That is me. I'm Shumon Bhaumik. I'm a professor of finance at Sheffield University Management School. Let me provide the context to what our very eminent panelists are going to talk about today by giving a brief summary of the work that my colleague Vania Sena and I have done for the edited volume we are talking about. Now, where our starting point was that, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, that COVID has both brought about a huge amount of uncertainty, which is perhaps dissipating gradually. We are now at a point where we perhaps can see the light at the end of the tunnel. We don't quite know whether that would be there 6 months down the road or 12 months down the road and so on, but we can sort of have a glimpse of that light from where we are today. But what hasn't changed perhaps that much is that COVID has perhaps brought about structural changes to the way that companies and economies and economic agents in general function. So therefore, we have to, the companies and the people there, in the managers and the others, would have to possibly think about very different ways of, taking their new business models forward, right? Now, one thing that Vanya and I sort of pondered about, and what our panelists today are going to talk much more about today, much more detail, is the fact that when we are faced with these kind of structural changes, and we have to rethink the models that we do. One, we have to survive the present, right? And one thing that we know, for example, that companies very often shut down, very viable companies who have a lot to contribute, who can potentially be productive, they shut down because of short-term lack of access to finance in the short run. They have cash flow problems, they have problems accessing external finance, and therefore they sort of give up in a sense, right? And so we can lose a lot of good companies, in a quote-unquote good companies, because of financial crunch that we are talking about. So that's one of the places where financing becomes extremely important. And the next thing, of course, is that if you have to rethink your business models, you have to reinvest in resources that will make you productive and competitive in the future. You have to then require access to finance in order to make those investments in many cases, right? So that's again, you need a long-term financing scenario. So you need short-term finance perhaps to get you through the crisis, through the pandemic, but then you need long-term finance in order to sort of reposition your business in the future. This is, where sort of today's panel comes into element, and our panelists are going to take you through the different aspects of it, right? So I will stop now, and I'll come back later at the end in order to sum things up. But let's now move on to our panelists, and I turn now to Professor Gary Dymski and Dr. Hannah Szymborska, and I think Professor Dymski is going to present. Am I correct, Mr. Professor Dymski?
Thank you. I'll be leading off and then turning the microphone over to Hannah for most of our presentation. Just to say that actually Shumon's mention of uncertainty and its impact at the firm level is a natural bridge to our topic, because what we focused on here was to bring in some Minskian perspectives to bear on and thinking about the impact of the COVID crisis on productivity in the UK. Could we have the next slide, please? Oh, next, there we go. Thank you. Basically, the theme of our chapter is to really focus on, as in some sense, similar to Shumon's chapter with Vanya, the idea of financial resilience. And in our case, we're thinking across businesses and households in general, to worry about the bridge to recovery as we go through the pandemic. And so this is something that is there. It's now threatened. The resilience is threatened, but has to be maintained as we go through. There are then some lessons that we can learn if we look back at the experience of the subprime crisis in the US, UK, and elsewhere, and some lessons learned from that experience. And of course, this is where we think of, when we think of uncertainty and so on, we immediately begin to think of the work of Hyman Minsky and his analysis of the endogenous problems that can arise in advanced capitalist countries in particular. So so as you see the bottom slide here, we see this emphasis on having sustainable cash flows and taking a balance sheet view. So could we have the next slide, please? I'll give you kind of the road into Minsky. Now, Minsky, of course, is known for theory of financial instability, the financial instability hypothesis, and spent many years refining his ideas of and noting not only that financial instability would arise endogenously in a capitalist economy, but his hope and his analysis was always that it would be possible to stabilize, as he put it, the unstable economy. This could be done by what he called big bank and big government, by which he meant the Federal Reserve in the case of the U.S. And then going to the second bullet point you can see there, by the fact that the less known emphasis that he made on countercyclical public expenditures, so that once your central bank intervenes to prevent financial collapse, you then have that public expenditure and the support that will permit a recovery to take hold. And this includes a need to take full advantage of the need to address issues that are there in your society before any crisis might occur. And in particular, he made some outstanding efforts to think through anti-poverty as a component of economic policy. So this all comes from his balance sheet approach, and he thinks of the economy as a set of balance sheets. In part, they're interconnected. Households and firms all have them, and essentially, it's not enough, is the point we'd like to emphasize in Minsky's work and in our own analysis of the current situation. Not enough to simply save one sector of the economy. In the case of a financial collapse, the banks, or we could think of other sectors that are particularly threatened. But you need an even-handed recovery, the kind of thing that, for example, we see the National Institute for Economic and Social Research now calling for. So a lesson from the 2008 subprime crisis that's relevant here is that, in a sense, there was a mistake. That in some sense you're seeing President Biden now trying to unwind that mistake and to do things differently. For while banks in the US and the UK were saved from collapse in that crisis, too little was done to offset the effect of widening spatial and other income and wealth gaps. And there was an erosion of public services, so that there was a kind of long-term decline in the societal foundations of productivity growth. We can't let this happen again. And I'll turn it now to my co-author.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you to the organizers for putting this event together. Could we have the next slide, please? Thank you. So the detailed analysis of the US subprime crisis is within the chapter. So in a nutshell, what really strikes us is that the US subprime crisis has highlighted very vividly the deep relationship between what's going on at the macro level versus what's going on at the level of the balance sheets of households and firms, and then feeds back into the macro level, so to speak. So these figures here are just very quick ways of illustrating, first of all, the immense pressures on household finances that have been mounting for decades before the crisis hit. And you can see that most of the types of expenditure, especially on healthcare, on housing for homeowners, as well as for rents, for renters, have grown at a much faster pace than the baseline rate of inflation, which means that the rising living standards have really become a challenge for households to kind of keep up and make ends meet. And in this context, we need to look at any changes in wealth and income within that period with that balance sheet approach in mind. So in the middle figure over here, you can see that while there was a very rapid increase in homeownership, particularly among those towards the bottom of the distribution of income, for whom you may argue homeownership is a vital way of improving their financial well-being. What we see is that increase in wealth accumulation has been, first of all, deeply unequal, which is shown on the right-hand side axis of that middle graph. And you can see that drastic differences in the homeownership rate at the end of that period. So after all that effort, so to speak, to increase the level of wealth, which should technically lead to long-term gains in wealth, what we actually observe is that the net effect, once the impact of the crisis in 2007 is taken into account, has not really allowed for that long-term improvement, and in fact turned out to be asset stripping and wealth stripping in the long term for those that are most vulnerable, financially speaking. And that is linked to, as we said, the broader balance sheet approach. We see on the right-hand side graph that but by 2006, we observed that the poorest households in the US have also continued to hold very high levels of leverage. So this really shows us that what Gary has highlighted towards the end of the previous slide, that the policy that was implemented after the 2007 crisis has not helped the household sector to tackle that financial resilience. Could we have the next slide, please? And when we now turn to the case of the UK, we can really start kind of pulling all these threads together. And in the UK, we observe some parallel issues relating to balance sheet fragility of households and businesses, in particular in the aftermath of the decade of austerity that we had after the global financial crisis hit. Availability of data is a constraint, but we do know from what's available that households among the poorest in terms of their wealth have very high levels of leverage, even in very recent years. They have experienced actual declines in real terms in their wealth and pay during the period of austerity. And of course, we do go into more detail in the chapter into the intersecting nature of these inequalities. We look at the intersection between income, race, gender, and regions. So this is a very complex set of financial problems that needs to be addressed by policy. And the reason is that when we turn now towards productivity, which is our topic today, it matters to look at that financial resilience of households and businesses. Firstly, because we know now, being in one of the deepest crises in recent decades, that the impact of that crisis is and will be very uneven and long-lasting across certain households. So the policy cannot just leave these households behind. We need active responses to address financial instability of households and businesses. From the more macroeconomic point of view, that of course has implications for aggregate demand. And from the Keynesian point of view, we know that aggregate demand is a crucial force that can allow the economy to recover and grow in the future. And even if you take a more firm-based approach, there is reason to consider this issue of balance sheet fragility, because of course, if households are under extreme financial distress, that constrains the realization of the workforce potential that could contribute to better productivity. So to sum up, what we need bold structural policy solutions. It is quite striking that the recent policy announcements that we have had in the UK seem to hint at austerity, at very limited change in the approach to macroeconomic policy response to the crisis compared to what it was 10 years ago in response to the 2007 crisis. And we do need to go back to Minsky, and we need to reconsider what his ideas of the big bank and the big government mean. However, what we do argue, and I would like to finish with this thought, is that we need to think about the kind of big government, the kind of big bank spending that is necessary to really understand who benefits from these policies in the most direct way, and which type of spending is needed to address those deep financial instability issues among households and businesses. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Dymski and Dr. Szymborska. We now move on to Dr. Eckhard Ernst from the ILO. The floor is yours, Dr.
Yeah, thank you very much. Great to be with you. Thanks for the organizers to bring this exciting panel together. And it's actually quite interesting with the points that Hannah and Gary finished off. I think it really leads nicely into what I would like to present. So if you can go to the next slide, please. I mean, my chapter and the presentation today is really more about policies and what the points that Hannah and Gary were making. What does it imply for our policy toolbox? And so I argue in the chapter essentially that our policy framework over the last 3 or 4 decades, if you want, has been focused very much on microeconomic efficiency. I mean, it started with the Washington Consensus, then we moved into OECD countries trying to promote deregulation of the labor market, the OECD jobs strategy. We have seen financial market deregulation, more opening up of new actors to enter the market, as Hannah was just mentioning, accessing low-income households to complicated mortgage systems, etc. We saw it on globalization, and we saw in particular also this dismantling and introduction of efficiency goals in public services, notably in healthcare. And so, I mean, I argue in the chapter actually that the question is really how big have these efficiency gains that we got out from all of this policy agenda really been? As if you look at long-term trends in productivity growth, it actually has slowed down over the last 4 decades. So if anything, the gains have been really small. Obviously, we don't know the counterfactual, but clearly this focus specifically on efficiency has not really brought in these enormous gains that we all were hoping to get. And in particular, what's more important is that somehow we lost sight of the stability and resilience part of it. So at the macro level, clearly we saw a lot of loss of stability, and not only about stability in terms of macroeconomic stability, but we lost inclusiveness, as Hannah and Gary was pointing out. We lost equality of opportunity. So all these problems that we have seen over the last few years, the financial crisis, one thing, but also job polarization and political instability, something that has been now affecting us quite a bit, and has knock-on effects also on our economic system. And then the latest event, obviously, the latest events, if you want, the pandemic, and the fact that our healthcare system, in particular in Europe, don't seem to be very well prepared for this type of major shock to our system. So the chapter really argues that somehow there might be a trade-off, and the question is obviously, why do we see this type of trade-off? And my argument is to say that, well, most of these efficiency considerations are really based on very simple linear risk models. I mean, the type of models that we use in financial market portfolio assessment, where you basically have an exogenous risk and you have a risk return prime of profile, and you basically assess where best to place your system or your portfolio, if you want, and your kind of choices in terms of what type of activities you want to support doesn't really depend on other actors, what other actors are doing. So the diversification is perfect, and this is exactly what's the logic that is behind our thinking in terms of efficiency gains. So you basically say, okay, but let's open up the economy, let's make everybody choosing his or her most efficient activity, and so then we all will be happy. But in reality, what we really have is that most risks are endogenous, and we saw that with the financial crisis. We obviously know things like bank runs. Bank runs, it's a typical situation of financial market crisis where risk is endogenous, because you see other people kind of running to the bank, you do the same. So the risk is not exogenously given, it depends on what others are doing. So this is the fat tail type of approach which leads to financial crisis. But then comes another point, what we also saw now with the pandemic, that there are actually situations where we don't even know what the risk is. We cannot properly assess the risk because there's no informed risk assessment possible. And we saw that with the pandemic, actually people had thought about the pandemic. People like Bill Gates or so were always mentioning that pandemic would be a possible shock to the system, but somehow we couldn't really assess how big the problem was. So we had no idea about the proper risk assessment. And what happens in the end is it's that the collective sentiments really take over. So once the risk hit, people will kind of express their anxiety and adjust collectively to that situation, which is why all these additional healthcare measures that we were taking were already anticipated to a large extent by people, by consumers, by not going outside, by not kind of trying to limit the social interactions. So there is this sentiment, this collective sentiment that creates additional crisis, an additional way of transmission of these type of shocks and produce outcomes that are collectively not foreseen or not be able to properly assess a priori. Yeah? And so the question obviously become, what do you do in this kind of situation? You can't use this type of efficiency-based framework anymore. So you need to the other things. So what after the financial crisis, what policymakers were putting forward is to require stress tests for banks. They required provisioning. So the Basel III framework basically increased the buffer on bank accounts, etc. But with the second type of kind of collective risk, if you want, even that is not sufficient. You have to have other approaches. You actually have to use something like minimax approach, where you basically try to minimize the maximum negative impact you can get. And you do this typically with scenario analysis. People who work in geostrategic analysis, they know this type of scenario analysis exactly for the same reason, because you can't really possibly anticipate the entire risk profile. No? And then what happened also after the financial crisis, and what again happened now with the pandemic, is you need to create new centralized institutions exactly for that reason, to provide collective credible signals. So I argue in the chapter essentially that in order to kind of address the situation where we cannot only rely on efficiency, but we have to integrate resilience as an additional tool. It is actually no real trade-off behind. That's not that you trade off efficiency and resilience, because you have to judge it over the longer term horizon. It's no point to judge from bottom to from trough to trough in a business cycle and say, well, oh, great, I did well. You have to look at over the longer term horizon in order to kind of properly anticipate what costs are involved if you don't integrate this risk analysis into your policy framework. And so in the chapter, I basically give more or less four key recommendations for policymakers. First, obviously, is something that's not surprising for you, I guess, when to hear coming from somebody from the ILO. We need to strengthen institutions, in particular those institutions that help ensuring risks, something like social protection, which is still undermined a lot by the efficiency-oriented framework that we currently have. We also need to have more early warning system for emerging risk, and that includes system-wide risk assessment. So, for instance, if we look at the labor market policies that only looks into active labor market policies and trying to find occupational transitions, that's not enough. You also need to look at what is actually happening when a shock like automation or robotization, etc., hits the labor market. Does everybody in the labor market has the possibility to move a new job, or are there some dead ends? And yet you cannot judge at the individual level. You really have to look at the collective level. The third point is obviously introducing buffer and slack, as I mentioned. So for our healthcare system, for instance, we have to think about maybe we need to make more provisioning. We need to have more intensive care units, even though we won't use them most of the time. And then my last point, and I think that's also related something to research that I'm doing currently with colleagues from Glasgow and from Sunderland, is to policy communication needs to be an integral part of our approach to such risk. In order to address a collective anxiety and address this endogenous creation of risk that is currently affecting our economy so much. So communication and lighthouse policies basically to reduce strategic uncertainty. And just to conclude, my point really is a very simple one: is that if you want to make sure that our societies are efficient and resilient, we need to properly account all types of risk, not only the individual risks that are idiosyncratic. We need to integrate collective risk, and that can only be done if we leave some slack in the system. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Eckert, Dr. Ernst, I'm sorry. And now we move on to Professor Don Weber, who's my colleague at the Sheffield University Management School, and his paper co-authored with Professor Gary Dimsky.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Simon. So in this paper, what we're going to try to do is explore the effects of COVID on the macroeconomic demand and supply issues which affect firm level productivity. This is a paper, as you say, co-authored with Gary Dymski, who spoke a few moments ago. Next slide, please. Okay, so the reopening of the key economy, the restarting of the economy post-COVID, seems to be focusing on three main areas. The first area is reopening the supply side, trying to get individuals perhaps back into work, increasing their supply to the market. It is a very supply-sided focused issue. At the same time, we've got the Welsh and the Scottish governments opening up their, or reducing their lockdown restrictions, which are going to enable individuals to be spending money towards the end of this month in their high streets, hopefully. So there is an issue which is focusing on demand and increasing the spending within communities. But the main narrative we're trying to emphasize that's been discussed normally is the reopening of the supply side of the market. The second narrative, which is dominant, we think, is that there is a need to continue to control public debt. So we suspect moving forward that there will be some strong central government policies, tax increases coming our way. There will probably also be continued pressure on the public services, whether they're going to receive much more money in order to supply the services remains an interesting question. But what we also know is that there is individuals working in these public sectors, and those individuals spend the money, and that money then is the income for companies. Thirdly, we think that there is a focus on trying to enhance productivity through the industrial strategy. Now, my interpretation of the industrial strategy is that there is a focus on high growth firms. But what we also know is that a large proportion of employment is in SMEs. We also know that quite a lot of innovation comes in SMEs, and that that may well be driving the economy. Moreover, the individuals who work in SMEs are the individuals who will also be spending in the economy, and that spending will be the revenue for many firms. So without this demand side, without this spending, we think that we are missing an important part of the story. Focusing on the supply side issues, therefore, only perhaps could well be slightly misguided. So we question, therefore, whether this focus on supply side aspects to enhance productivity, to stimulate the economy, to grow out of the effects of the COVID pandemic on productivity. We think that there is also a big role on the demand side. Next slide, please. Okay, so restoring the economy to the pre-COVID conditions will take time. We know that the production side has changed a lot. We know that companies have had to be agile, respond to a lower number of individuals, meeting them face to face to purchase products. We know that there has been an increase in sales online. The strategy, as we emphasize, has been many supply side with respect to fiscal discipline. There seems to be an emphasis on trying to increase the amount of exports. What do exports do? Export brings money into the economy because individuals abroad demand our products. Okay, so what we're emphasizing really is that the focus of the narrative seems to be mainly on the supply side, but we think this in part is because of the measure that we use for productivity. When we focus on productivity, we focus on a one-dimensional aspect of productivity. That is, what we do is we subtract the market value of goods and services used up or transformed in the production process from total revenues. But we could think of this aspect in a different way. Instead of that gross value added being on a one-dimensional continuum, we could instead think of it in a two-dimensional way. Next slide, please. So how do we think of it in a two-dimensional way? Well, what we do is we subtract the market value of goods and services used up or transformed in the production process at the firm level by looking at the costs of raw materials and intermediate inputs used up in the production process. So that's C star over to the quantity. So the vertical axis, the horizontal axis is quantity, and where you've got the A and B on the right, that should go down to a particular quantity of output, Q star, for instance. Okay, so the costs of the bottom part, it's underneath the C star B line. We take that away from the total revenues of the firm, but the revenues are the sales price multiplied by the quantity sold. And we know that revenues are strongly influenced by demand. So the point A is likely to be, or should be, on the demand curve. So how, therefore, do we increase the productivity of workers? I should say, of course, that the two-dimensional aspect, or two-dimensional way of thinking about productivity means that instead of the GVA being on a one-dimensional continuum, productivity itself is that rectangle, S star to A to B to C star. So how do we increase that rectangle? Well, we can increase that rectangle by pushing S star up, in other words, charging higher prices for our products. We can push C star down, such as supermarkets paying farmers less money for their milk. Or we can increase the scale of output, that is by pushing the quantity further to the right. Now, in order to get productivity per worker, all we do is we divide that rectangle by the number of workers, or whatever our labor variable is, such as the number of hours worked, etc. But what we're trying to say and illustrate here is that COVID has effectively reduced demand for many firms. The demand curves have shifted to the left, and therefore the point A is shifted to the left, and therefore the productivity of these workers has shifted to the left. If we wish to increase the productivity of workers, what we need to do is shift that A point to the right. We need to get firms receiving more revenues by selling more products. Next slide, please. Okay. Unfortunately, the picture is not easy to summarize across many firms because they've all been influenced in different ways. Part of this is because of the different, perhaps implicit contracts firms had with their consumers. Part of it is because of supply chains breaking down. Some firms will not be opening up, and therefore companies along the supply chain will have to find alternative suppliers of their intermediate inputs. And then, of course, of financial intermediary issues, there are, or there may well be, different abilities to access finance to support firms' recovery from the effects of the pandemic. So we're understanding these issues through the demand side, and each area is going to have different demand side issues. Individual workers often cluster around the company that they work for. The companies cluster often in cities. So the money that individuals are spending are going to be clustered around the areas where many of these products are being produced. So you've got location-specific demand forces at the local level, at the regional level, at the national level. Take firms in rural areas, for instance. You have two main categories, I would argue, of firms in rural areas. Some firms only supply products to their local population, in which case the scale of output is going to be very low and their productivity is going to be very low, although it's often resilient because the local population buy products from the local shops. But there's also rural firms who are incredibly productive. And the reason for that is that they export the products out of the area. Okay, and they grow because of the selling of their products elsewhere. So you've got this very interesting, very complex web of the interactions between demand and supply, which vary across firms, across space, across regions, and also across national levels. So what this means is that if we're trying to recover from the pandemic, we need to be very aware of the effects of demand, because if we tax high, if we dampen our fiscal expenditure, then this may well stunt our ability to recover from the pandemic and exacerbate our productivity problem. Next slide, please. So here's an illustration to show part of our thinking. So if we've got gross value added per worker on the vertical axis, and we've got time on the horizontal axis. We start at the far left when the pandemic first hit. It had very varied effects on different firms in different parts of the market. If you have a look at the local butchers line, for instance, individuals stayed in, they were locked down. The demand for sales from butchers crashed. But on the other hand, they recovered relatively quickly because individuals were avoiding going to many supermarkets, and they thought they could interact with fellow people less if they shop locally. So some local butchers have done incredibly well, and habits have formed so that individuals are increasingly buying some of their products locally. There was, of course, a big demand for toilet paper, and that was in short supply, and they had different demand dynamics in different ways. But overall, it appears that supermarkets have benefited in many ways. But as you if you go along the top line of the supermarket, it's also the case that fewer people appear to be shopping in the store, and more people are being shopping online and having deliveries that way. If you then look at the non-essentials, of course, the level of non-essentials drops substantially. But when we begin to open up, because of those changing habits, because of those changes in implicit contracts, perhaps because of a need for greater social interaction, we don't know how non-essentials, the production, the supply, and the productivity of these types of firms, how they're going to recover. And it's likely to be the case, because of these breaking in habits, etc., that different firms are going to recover in uncertain and unforeseeable ways. Next slide, please. Finally, I think there's a few other issues that we need to explore. One is potentially remotivating and re-recruiting furloughed staff and individuals who have become unemployed. Some of these would have lost many of their skills. Others will be reflecting on whether they want to go back to the same company, whether they wish to instead pursue other ideas, other lines of being able to contribute to society. It also the case that partly because of this, but for some other reasons, some skilled workers may not be returning to their firms, and therefore they are less able or unable to pass their knowledge on to the new workers. And this may stunt the recovery of productivity as well. There will be firm-to-firm linkage problems. Some firms will decide or be unable to reopen. And of course, the firm-to-consumer linkages, the implicit contracts, etc., are difficult things to foresee. But so to summarize, what we're emphasizing here is that we need to be very aware of the demand side of the argument. Individuals, consumer spending is the revenue, of course, for firms, and without that consumer spending, without being aware of what drives that consumer spending and the effects of taxes on consumer spending, for instance, then we may be recovering much slower than many of our competitors. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Weber. Now, for the sake of time, we move over to the questions right away, and I can see one question already that has been typed in, and this is about the question is whether, the panelists have talked about a lot of bold policies, and then the question is whether they actually foresee any of this happening in practice.
That's let me start with that. Actually, we held a meeting yesterday morning of the co-investigators of the project together with our lead investigators, and we were contemplating the problem of policy coherence quite a lot, and looking at a government that is in this country now in a kind of transition in along several dimensions. One dimension is the Brexit questions. Another is the post-pandemic versus current pandemic posture. And of course, this government was also in the process of undertaking the not only something like its own new initiatives, but also looking at the giving many more powers to the local governments and to the combined and local authorities across the nation and to the regions. So this has led to a situation that is hard to decode right now. It's not clear whether the industrial strategy will be remade. It's not clear what the roles of the LEPs will be or other things. But it's clear that the message from all of our papers is and presented today is the same, that we have to respond forcefully to the uncertainty, the delays that have been made. Going to the first paper by Shimon and Vanya, in terms of introducing technology and introducing innovation are significant, and we need to restore the basis so that we can take advantage of that investment as it comes. That's going to work along all those dimensions, of course. The second thing is that I really liked what Eckhart mentioned. The idea of policy integration is something that is really a great concept for us to think about, not only at the international, national levels, but also in this as we move toward full devolution across the regions as well. I think this idea of policy integration and co-thinking is a marvelous one to take forward.
Maybe I just can jump on that. I mean, I would agree with the question that it actually it's challenging some of the recommendations we have, and it's clear that's not something that will change overnight. I mean, if you think that we're still working through some of the institutional adjustments after the global financial crisis, that has been 12 years ago now. So I think that yes, it will take some time, but I think that people like in this panel and others are thinking about this issue should move forward. What I can tell you, where I'm personally very optimistic, is that even at least at the international level, among international agencies, there is a lot of convergence in terms of thinking about the same issues, thinking about the broader policy framework, including inclusiveness into issues of efficiency. I'm personally involved in the collaboration with our colleagues from the International Monetary Fund exactly on these issues. So again, change is slow for sure, but it's coming. And I think that especially now with the third element that we haven't really talked today about climate change, I think the urgency is clearly on the table, and people do realize that if we want to make a change, we need to move forward quickly.
Thanks very much, Professor Dymski and Dr. Ernst. We already have a second question, so let me just take you to that. And the question there is, and this isn't particularly in relevance to apropos Professor Dymski's arguments, that we are already seeing an adjustment to or people adapting and the economy adapting to a state of uncertainty, and they're sort of starting to treat uncertainty as quote unquote normal, if we can put it that way. Right. And what does it mean for the wider points made about productivity and the leveling up agenda in particular?
Maybe I can kickstart the discussions.
Sure.
I think the two questions are somewhat related to each other. I think that from the theory point of view, in terms of what economists have to say, I think that there is I think there is quite a big group of economists who would say that, you know, uncertainty has always been present, and the fact that it's now becoming perhaps more evident is something that, you know, we should expect to continue into the future. So I think it's absolutely right that we need to design policies that are built around this idea of uncertainty. In terms of the policy agenda, more specifically, my main concern is the obsession or the commitment of many of the current policymakers to tackle the deficit and to see all policy interventions as being somewhat brought back to the issue of controlling the deficit. I think until we get rid of this break on the type of policies that can be implemented, the change will be quite difficult. Having said that, I do believe that there are several very good developments that have been happening, and that relates to kind of the broader pressure in society and public discourse in international organizations, as Eckhart has mentioned. There is that hunger for change, and we see policies that just a few years ago were completely radical and unthought of being discussed in different circles very openly, like wealth taxes, like issues around whom exactly policy is targeting, what are the resources in the economy that we can build upon, and thinking about productivity and leveling up more specifically. There is an issue that I think has been raised recently in terms of the housing market recovery and housing prices rising perhaps faster in some of the regions like Yorkshire than in London. However, I think that this is not going to lead to any long-term leveling up. We do need that stronger productivity changes that have been suggested, I think, by all the speakers. With that, I'm going to move on to the other speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Szymborska. It's already a question, and this one is from Tim Vorley, whom we know very well, and it is that he's intrigued by what the panel thinks that the government needs to do differently as part of what would succeed or what sort of succeeds the industrial strategy. Are there any policy recommendations in particular? And let me throw in a fourth question that has come in because we may try to deal with them together given the time that we have left, which is that that we are talking about, there's a sort of bit of a observation that perhaps the discussion is somewhat general, at this stage, within the panel. So the question is there can the panel be a bit more specific about the types of policies that can help overcome the uncertainty caused by the pandemic, especially for small businesses? So I think the industrial strategy question obviously has relevance for this as well. So perhaps we can tackle the two together.
I'll try to be brief. First, with regard to industrial strategy, I think it's fair to say that something that Eckhart said is very important in mentioning the idea of that crises are endogenous and yet at the same time unforeseeable. That has to do with the fact that we've had really segmented thinking. We've seen this as a problem actually in the ESRC macroeconomics project, that there's little interconnection between people working on ecological issues, sustainability issues, and those working on macroeconomic recovery issues. So we need to really join up these dots. And this is where I think we should think of the sweet spot of policies that can address the shortages of aggregate demand on the one hand, that can move in the direction of, let's say, a Green New Deal on the other. And something also that was implicit in what the first presentation, Eckhart's presentation and the paper that you co-authored with Vanya suggested, was the problem of worker capacity. And we have to keep in mind that we have to provision for and bring people along. That's going to cost money. And maintaining all the balance sheets in order, I think, is not going to be a pretty business. So we have to be ready to absorb the idea that there could be some continuing public debt as we use government levers to try to bring the private economy back into life.
I mean, I just wanted to jump on this as well in terms of what does it mean for labor market policy specifically. I'm not talking about industry policy because that's not necessarily my area of expertise, but I wanted to bring in the labor aspect. As Gary mentioned, you need to bring the people along. And I think it very concretely, our current framework in terms of how to activate people back into the labor market once they lost their job is to say, well, first of all, we give you strong incentives to actually search for a job yourself, and then we give you some basic support in terms of, I don't know, job search, looking through vacancy notes, etc. And that's it. You know, we basically say, okay, well, it's basically you by yourself. There's no foresight involved in it. If you really want to have a forward-looking type of industrial policy, you also need to see how do you bring the current workforce, and whether employed or unemployed doesn't matter. How do you bring the current workforce up to the point that they can actually fill the spots, the vacancies that are coming up? And that requires an integrated framework that involves both businesses, education institution, and policymakers, or if you want job search, public employment services. And this is something that, for instance, my colleagues and I here at the International Labour Organization are working on, trying to understand how would such a framework look like? What would it involve in terms of bringing, for instance, new technologies on board? There are companies, as you might know, that are working on kind of competence profiling through AI, etc. And we want to see to what extent can we use this type of technologies and integrate this into our current way of providing labor market policies. Now, I don't have a concrete answer. I know that things are moving forward. We had just talked yesterday with a company from Mountain View that implementing some of these tools in Indiana in the US. And so the question is, what are the kind of experience that we have with these types of tools to make a forward-looking approach to the labor market change, rather than kind of just running after any change that comes? And I think that's kind of that's my answer to that from a policy perspective, what type of approach we would offer.
Does anyone else want to chip in? Yeah, hi.
Yeah, I think, yeah, thanks, Johan. I think we need to be braver. We have spending habits being switched substantially to online markets. We have town centres which are almost ghost towns. We have many shops which simply are not going to be opening up. The atmosphere within town centres is significantly changing. This is going to have impacts on housing markets. It's going to have knock-on effects on what communities do, whether communities evolve. I think we need to ask, go out into the field, ask what communities want. We need to know which direction they wish to go in. I suspect many individuals would want new experiences in their town centres. And I suspect that it's the locals who know what experiences are required by their community. Moving forward, I think policy could be out there to support the establishment, the reinvigoration of social enterprises, of community businesses. There were many organizations out there supporting lots of individuals in need. Many community businesses were delivering Meals on Wheels and these sort of things. When the pandemic hit, many of the individuals working in those community businesses either had to shut down or had to adapt drastically. What we found in one of our studies is that individuals who were furloughed then took on those roles. The social fabric of our communities really needs to be supported. I've got a big concern about what's going forward with town centres, and I think we need to start thinking locally and have policies which reinvigorate the towns, re-employs individuals locally, and provides greater experiences. I think that's what people want, and I think that's what they should receive.
Thanks, Professor Weber. I think that we are coming to the end of the today's webinar. It's nearly 10 o'clock. So let me just wrap it up. I mean, I don't think I have to summarize what our eminent panelists has already said, but I think that I'd like to sort of bring in perhaps one other risk that perhaps hasn't been mentioned as yet, but which as economists we know that is extremely relevant, and that's also endogenous, which is essentially political risk. And if there is a rising inequality, and that cannot be addressed with a social safety net, largely because the growth is not there because of the lack of productivity growth as well, among other things, then the political shock that the system may get may actually sort of lead to greater disruptions in the future, perhaps far more than what the pandemic has done to us over the last 12 months. And this, as somebody who works in the area of political economy, is one of my greatest concerns. So with that, I think we come to an end to this seminar, and I would sort of hand it over to our colleagues at the Productivity Insights Network to take this forward.
So just to finally say that you can get a copy of the Productivity and Pandemic book via Edward Elgar. And if you want to see any of the live tweets that we've been putting out today, please do check us out on social media. Thank you all for joining us, and this is the last in the series, as Simon mentioned, so thank you for joining us for the whole series, and you can catch up on any of the events on our YouTube channel, and we'll be sending out the details about this one then, and the recording will be made available later today. Thank you all very much for joining us.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye.